welcome. The passion and crucifixion of Jesus was so important to the gospel writers, with all four of them writing fulsome accounts of the events, that the German theologian Martin Kähler had no qualms in describing Mark's gospel as the story of Jesus' passion with a long introduction. But why? Why did Jesus die? Well, the answer to that question is found on two levels. On the first, historical level, the conflict between Jesus and Israel's religious leadership had been growing for some time. His opponents were troubled by the things he said, especially in relation to the law. And at times they believed he was downright blasphemous, a crime for which he could have been stoned to death at the time. Also, there's the famous episode of the cleansing of the temple. The temple was sacrosanct, lying at the very heart not only of Israel's religious life, but also her political life, her identity. Jesus' outburst, chasing the money changers, and his comments about the temple being destroyed, well, they were highly provocative and bound to land him in serious trouble with the authorities. Finally, there was great tension between the Jews and the Romans, who, of course, ruled Judea at the time. And Jerusalem could very quickly become a tinderbox, especially during the festival of Passover, when the city was full to bursting with people celebrating their deliverance from slavery in Egypt. Unsurprisingly, at the first hint of trouble, the Romans would quash it swiftly and brutally. Now, add to that Jesus' proclamation of a new kingdom and a new king, which in the eyes of the Romans would have been an act of sedition, and we can see that the atmosphere following Jesus' arrest would have been highly charged. Now, put all this together, and it's no surprise that the religious leaders wanted Jesus dead. And it wouldn't take much for the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, to agree to their demand. And so Jesus was scourged and executed by crucifixion, the most humiliating and painful death that the Romans, who were masters of such things, could devise. And for many people, that's all Jesus' death was. It was the execution of a condemned man. And for so many who'd dared to hope that he was the Messiah, well, that hope died with him. But for a small group of Jesus' followers, his death came to be seen not as an execution, but a sacrifice. And that, as we'll see, made all the difference. But what made them come to this conclusion? Today, a sacrifice is about the costly self-giving of someone in some way. So, in the case of Jesus, we could say that his fight for the coming of a new kingdom, a kingdom founded on peace and love, a fight that ultimately led to his death, well, we could look upon that as a sacrifice. But that's not how the Jews of the first century would have seen it. Such a death wouldn't have been seen as a sacrifice at all, because the notion of a sacrifice meant something very, very different indeed. So again, what made them think that Jesus' death was a sacrifice? Well, first, let me remind you that Israel was longing for God's promised Messiah. For some, this kingly figure, this son of David, would raise up an army to defeat the Romans and set Israel free. It's a position that we see, for example, in the Zealots and the Sicarii. But if you read the Old Testament prophets and the writings from around the time of Jesus, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, you'll see that Israel's principal hope, what they were really longing for, wasn't some great political warrior, but a new exodus. And what was the key to the first exodus? It was the Passover. It was the sacrificing of an unblemished male lamb, daubing its blood on the doorposts and lintels of the houses, and then eating its flesh. It was this liturgical act, it was this sacrifice that inaugurated the Exodus. And Jesus' death was understood as a sacrifice that would bring about a new Exodus, precisely because it echoed the first Exodus so closely. Now, let me explain this in more detail. First of all, who was the key figure in the first Exodus? It was Moses, of course. And so, as I said last time, one of the key images of the promised Messiah was that of a new Moses. And when Jesus' followers looked at Jesus' own life and ministry, they saw that it chimed remarkably well with that of Moses. There were distinct parallels. So, for example, both of them were born under the reign of a ruthless king, Pharaoh in the case of Moses and Herod the Great in the case of Jesus. And both of these kings ordered the killing of innocent children. In a desperate attempt to reduce the Hebrew population, Pharaoh ordered that their newborn sons should be killed. And as you recall, I'm sure, King Herod ordered the slaying of all the baby boys in Bethlehem on learning of Jesus' birth from the Magi. Both Moses and Jesus then found safety in Egypt. Ironically, Moses was taken in by Pharaoh's daughter, and Matthew tells us that Mary and Joseph took the infant Jesus down into Egypt for safety. Subsequently, both came out of Egypt and, after passing through water, went out into the wilderness. Moses crossed the Red Sea and led the Israelites through the wilderness to Mount Sinai. Jesus was baptized in the River Jordan, and then he was led by the Spirit into the desert, where he fasted for 40 days and 40 nights, just as Moses fasted for 40 days and 40 nights on Mount Sinai. Jesus was tempted by Satan during his 40 days in the desert, just as Israel was tested during their 40 years in the wilderness. But whereas the Israelites gave in to their testing again and again, Jesus resisted the temptation of Satan. When Moses descended from Sinai, he gave the people of Israel the laws of the covenant on the tablets of stone. And in Matthew's Gospel, when Jesus leaves the desert, he begins his public ministry. How? By declaring the law of the new covenant in the Sermon on the Mount. And these parallels, they even extend to the wondrous signs done by Moses and Jesus. So, for example, Moses' first sign was turning the water of the River Nile into blood. It was the first of the plagues. And in his Gospel, John tells us that Jesus' first miraculous sign was turning water into wine. And again, while in the wilderness, Moses told the hungry Israelites that God would feed them with bread called manna from heaven each morning, and the flesh of quails in the evening. In John chapter 6, Jesus miraculously feeds the hungry crowd with a few loaves of bread and the flesh of 2 fish. Importantly, Jesus then says this, "Truly, truly, I say to you, it was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." They said to him, "Sir, give us this bread always." Jesus said to them, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst." So, as you can see, the parallels between Moses and Jesus are unmistakable. But what about the Passover itself? How does that fit with the cross? Well, as I said, before Israel could embark on their exodus from Egypt, they had to celebrate the Passover. And Jesus, before his own exodus, before his own departure, celebrated the Passover with his disciples. But he doesn't just celebrate the Passover, he transforms it. He transforms it into the Eucharist. During what we know as the Last Supper, Jesus told the disciples that they should continue to celebrate the Eucharist in remembrance of him. Now, likewise, at the first Passover, Moses said to the people, "This day shall be for you a memorial day, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations, as a statute forever. You shall keep it as a feast." Also, during the Last Supper, Jesus refers to the cup of wine as the cup of his blood, the cup of the new covenant. Now, this calls to mind Moses' words at the foot of Mount Sinai, when he sealed the covenant by throwing the blood of sacrifice animals on the people and on the altar. He called it the blood of the covenant. Now, much of what goes on at the Last Supper sounds very much like a normal Passover celebration. There's the singing of the traditional psalms known as the Hallel Psalms, which are Psalms 113 to 118. There's unleavened bread and cups of wine for the traditional blessings. But there's one essential thing missing: the lamb. At the heart of the first Passover, and every Passover since, was the sacrificial lamb. Because Passover wasn't simply a meal. No, it was a sacrifice. As I said, Moses instructed the people to take an unblemished lamb, sacrifice it, that is, slit its throat, and paint the blood on the doorposts and lintels of the houses, and then consume it. But there's no mention of a lamb at the Last Supper. Now, I can't believe that when Jesus told the disciples to prepare for Passover, they simply forgot the lamb. So I think it must have been there on the table. But bizarrely, it's not the focus. Instead, the focus is shifted onto Jesus, who says, "This is my body. This is my blood." In other words, Jesus identifies himself as the Passover lamb, just as John the Baptist had foretold when he first saw Jesus down by the River Jordan. "Behold the Lamb of God," he said. "Behold him who takes away the sins of the world." Yes, Jesus is the sacrificial lamb of the new, the definitive Passover, who will give his life for the freedom of his people. Not freedom from the Romans or any earthly kings or tyrants, but from the ancient curse of sin, that curse that had separated humanity from God from the days of our first parents. For the followers of Jesus, this link with the Passover lamb was intensified by the way Jesus was executed. You see, at the the Passover. You didn't just pop down to the butcher's and buy a lamb. No, you took your lamb to the temple, where you would slit its throat, and its blood would be collected in bowls by the priests, who would then take the blood and pour it at the base of the altar. The lamb would then be taken home to be roasted. But before taking it home, it would be prepared for roasting by driving a stake of wood down its back and another through its forelegs in the shape of a cross. It's a practice that we find described in the Mishnah, which is an ancient collection of early rabbinic traditions. And as the early Christian apologist Justin Martyr refers to the practice in his dialogue with Trypho, it's clear that this link between the Passover lambs on their crosses and Jesus hanging from his cross wasn't lost on the early Christian community. And there were other connections. For example, it was forbidden to break the bones of the Passover lamb. In Exodus chapter 12, verse 46, Moses says, "The lamb shall be eaten in one house. You shall not take any of the flesh outside the house, and you shall not break any of its bones." When it comes to the crucifixion, it was a long, drawn-out process, basically a process of slow asphyxiation. The only way to take a breath on the cross was to raise yourself up. So, to hurry the process along, the soldiers would often break the condemned man's legs. And when it came to the robbers on either side of Jesus, that is exactly what happened. But when they came to Jesus, they found that he was already dead. So, as John solemnly tells us in his gospel, not one of his bones were broken. John also tells us that when the soldiers gave Jesus vinegar to drink, they offered it to him on a branch of hyssop. What's important about that? Well, just listen to this passage describing the first Passover in Exodus chapter 12. Then Moses called all the elders of Israel and said to them, "Go and select lambs for yourselves according to your clans, and kill the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and touch the lintel and the doorposts with the blood that is in the basin." No Jew would miss that. Also in John's Gospel, we're told that the crucifixion took place on the day of preparation for the Passover. In other words, John is telling us that Jesus breathed his last, and from his wounded side poured out his lifeblood at exactly the same time as the lambs were being sacrificed in the temple. Can all of this be merely coincidence? Of course not. Jesus is the Passover lamb. That's what the disciples came to understand. He is the sacrificial Lamb of God who by his death sets us free, who inaugurates the definitive Exodus. What he began in the upper room, breaking his body and pouring out his blood for the sins of many, is consummated and fulfilled on Calvary. But there's one final detail that I should perhaps point out here. Jesus wasn't an unwilling victim like the poor Passover lambs, because not only was he the sacrificial lamb, but he was also the priest that offered the sacrifice. And John tells us this by noting that at his crucifixion, Jesus wears a seamless linen garment, which was exactly the kind of robe worn by the high priest at Passover. Finally, just as Moses' work wasn't completed with the Exodus, because he still had to lead Israel to the promised land, or to the edge of the promised land, well, neither is Jesus' work of salvation complete with his death on the cross. In order for us to be saved, the resurrection has to take place. As Paul tells us in Romans chapter 4, verse 25, Jesus was put to death for our trespasses and raised for our justification. As one of my old New Testament tutors was very fond of reminding me, it's important to understand that the resurrection was so much more than Jesus simply being resuscitated from the dead. Rather, in his resurrection, Jesus' humanity was transformed and glorified. And by uniting ourselves to him, we're able to share in his glorified humanity. We're able to share his risen life. As we proclaim in the Eucharist, Lord, by your cross and resurrection, you have set us free. Well, that brings us to the end of our look at some of the images of Jesus in the Scriptures. I hope you found them interesting. But above all, I pray that they've enabled you to grow closer to Jesus, who is our life, who is our salvation. And I pray that God may richly bless you